Nick Durant here with Tattoo University, and I'm doing a series here on what it takes to fix up a tattoo kit. And the last video we did, I showed you that the thin cords on a clip cord are no good. So with the thicker wire, you don't have to use as much voltage. So here's my clip cord that I fixed. After I fixed my clip cord, I fixed the foot pedal in the same manner. It's the same thing. I didn't change anything out on it except for the wire. And it's the same thing as the clip cord. I just had to pop this open, pull off the old wire, and solder the new wire onto the little switch in there. And so now we have new wire on our foot pedal and new wire on our clip cord. And as you'll see in this video, I have tuned this machine, switched out all of these springs, and made sure it is now running correctly. I set this up as a typical hard-hitting fast liner, and in our next video I will show you how to set up a sculpting liner. We've talked about how to remove your coils without breaking any of the wires. We've taken the springs and everything off of the tattoo machine, and we are going to start putting things back together. Now, as you're doing this, you should realize that because these are cheap machines, we have to do all of this stuff. Think about that, because if you get a good machine, you shouldn't have to do this type of stuff. By seeing all the things you have to fix on a cheap machine, you should know how a good machine should be and how a good machine should run. In the end, this machine's going to run and it's going to work, but it still might not be as good as a machine that has better quality parts on it. If this is what you have, we always take what we have and we improve it until we can get better equipment. We got rid of the extra space in the cores, and now we're going to make sure we get a good contact. So all these little areas with this little rubber that's covering our contacts, we're going to clean that off, and we're going to sandpaper this a little bit, make sure we get a good connection there. We don't want to expose too much of this. We just want to make sure that it doesn't get in the way of our connection. So we're just going to take this little heat shrink off right here. And then we're just going to give this a little sandpaper to make sure that there's nothing on this lug either. And try not to move your wires around while you're doing this. Keep it pretty still. They always shrink wrap these, but I don't like that because I don't know what direction they put the capacitor. And I like to make sure that my clip cords are going the right direction. So I'm going to take this off so I can see which way they made this capacitor go. Sometimes you get a little grease or some kind of coating that's on top of your cores, so we're going to sandpaper those off to make sure that nothing's in the way between this and the armature bar. And we're going to get the top of these. Now when that's done, we're going to start putting things back together. So these machines are actually made out of aluminum, so they come with a yoke. So we make sure the yoke's in there. And what I'm going to start doing is just putting this machine back together, but I'm not doing any finishing touches at this point in time. I'm just going to start getting things in place. I need to do the springs, I need to check the height on the coils, and a bunch of other things. So we're just going to kind of set it up, but not tighten anything down yet. Now we're going to start messing with our armature bars and our springs. Something you need to think about when it comes to armature bars is the length and the weight of the armature bar. So if you look at this armature bar, I've just ground down some of the material off of that. And this one comes in at 3 ounces. Now, this armature bar, these two armature bars are the same length, but this armature bar is 4 ounces, and this armature bar that's the same length is 5 ounces. So they have different weights even though they're the same length. And armature bars are made out of different steels and different materials, so you get different weights on those, so you need to check those. So you just need to make sure you have the correct length and the correct weight for what you want. If you want a faster machine, you would want a lighter armature bar like this one, where I just ground down. You can get a speed bar. It's just a lighter weight bar so that your machine will run faster. If you want your machine to run slower, you would use a heavier bar. Here comes the fun part where we get to mess with springs. Now these are the springs that came on this machine. Typically, these springs that you get from these cheap machines are 18 gauge springs. And what we're going to do with this first machine, we're going to set these machines up differently. But the first machine is going to be a hard-hitting one-liner, your typical lining machine with a dime gap, and it's going to be faster. This spring setup is not for that. A longer front spring with more bend isn't going to make the machine run faster. Your front spring adjusts the speed of the machine. What we would really want for this machine would be a nice fat chunky front spring. Now your rear spring's gonna adjust your duty and your tension, and your front spring's gonna adjust your speed. The spring and the weight of your armature bar. Now there's a ton of setups I could do with different springs and different armature bars, there's a lot of variables. You don't always have to have a certain kind of spring on your tattoo machine, you know, a liner, a shader. And the question I always get is, what kind of springs you put on your shader? And it's really whatever works. So you just need to learn how springs work and how you can adjust them and adjust your machine with these springs. You don't always have to have a certain kind of spring on your machine. You just need to think, what am I trying to do with this machine? What's this machine going to be used for? And then what are the proper numbers that I need, the proper cycles per second and duty for that machine, and then figure out what springs will get you to those numbers. And then any combination of springs that get you those numbers and get the machine running the way you want it to run, either hard hitting or maybe not so hard hitting, that's the springs you want to use. It doesn't always have to be the same. They could be 18 gauge, they could be 16 gauge, whatever works to get you to those numbers. With springs, it's all about how flexible the spring is. How much bend it has, and the relationship between the contact screw and this spring right here. So a thinner spring, like this thin ruler here, has a lot of wobble in it, a lot of bend. When it comes up and touches your contact screw, it doesn't immediately go down. It continues to bend, staying in contact with your contact screw a little while longer. And that gives it a little more time, slowing your machine down. If you have a thicker piece of metal like this ruler here, you have no bend. So the spring comes up, hits the contact screw, does not bend, so it immediately goes down. And that speeds up the process because there's no bend in this. As soon as it touches, it goes back down, which makes the machine run faster. You have to think about what type of machine you want. If you're running a shader or a color packer, you want these long flexible springs because you're not running these really fast. You want these to slow down a little bit and have a little bit more of a stroke. The more this bends, the further your armature bar travels, giving you a longer stroke. If it just hit and stopped and then went down, you would have a short stroke. Because of the bend in this spring, because it's flexible, instead of your armature bar stopping here, it continues to go up because you have that flex in your front spring, giving you a longer stroke. So a liner, you don't want that. You just want fast, and you want it to hit and go down, short stroke. So you don't want a long spring on your liner, you want a short, fat, stiff spring. Springs are made out of materials like this. This is a piece of banding material that is used to hold crates together. You can get a big old spool of this stuff and you just cut it off. What they do is they buy a huge spool of this and they cut little pieces off and sell it to you and make a ton of money off of you buying it. You can also make them out of spring stock, which if you get the spring stock, it'll tell you what gauge it is on there. So I prefer a front spring and a rear spring because you can adjust these easier. I do not like these springs that come like this and it's a one-piece spring. They're harder to adjust, so I usually stay away from these. Again, we're looking at how easily the metal bends and flexes, or if it doesn't bend or flex. Typically with a liner, you're going to use a fat, nubby front spring. For your typical liner, you want a fast running liner, hard hitting, short gap, fat front spring. These do not bend as much. If you want to set up a slower running liner or a shader color packer, you're going to use something like this because it does have flex and it will slow your machine down a little bit. You can see these are a little longer, a little more flexible. So if you use a thinner rear spring, it has more flex to it. But if you take the same gauge and make it fatter, that gives it more tension, less flex. A thinner rear spring will give you less tension. Your rear spring controls the upward tension on your armature bar. So if you have a lot of tension, you need more pull to pull that down. A thinner rear spring will have less tension than a fatter rear spring if it is the same thickness. But if you go up, a thicker rear spring, 22 gauge or 23 gauge, will actually be harder because it's thicker. You can either give it more width to give it more tension, or you can give it more thickness to give it more tension. When you twist this, make sure you put pressure on top of your cores. That way this won't spin around, because what will happen is it will spin around and your core will actually come loose from your coil. I'm just attaching everything very loosely. It's not permanent. Just putting everything into position. Now I get to choose what kind of springs I want in here. And these were the springs that came with the machine. And like I said, a flexible, longer spring is not going to make this machine run faster, because this one is going to be your typical fast running liner with a dime gap. So we want a nice fat nubby front spring and a rear spring that will give me enough tension to make this machine hit nice and hard. So I just have to come up with the combination I like that will give me that. So we're going to try these springs first, and I'm going to clean these up and adjust them. And I want it to run faster, so I'm not going to use a armature bar that weighs 5 ounces. I'm actually going to use one that weighs 4 ounces. Lighter weight armature bars should give me a faster running machine. The more bend you put in your front spring, the more tension it has. It's harder to push down on it. So usually I use about a 15. On this one I wanted to do a little bit more, so I bent it a little bit more. O-rings are used to quiet down your machine and also put a little more tension on your front spring. So some people say that O-rings will increase your voltage, but I don't see enough of a problem there not to do this. And I want more tension there, so I'm going to put that O-ring there, which is going to give me a lot of tension on this front spring with the increased bend, and it should speed this up. Okay, so I'm going to start putting this back together. I'm just going to test to see how the machine is running, and I'm going to put it back together. So I'm going to take my shoulder washers, put them on the frame. Alright, now on the sides of my plastic shoulder washers, I want to have a metal washer, and that's going to keep me from squishing that washer and breaking it. It's going to put even pressure on that plastic washer, and get nice thick plastic washers, because the little thin ones will break really easy. I'm going to do the same thing with my front post here. So get those on. Make sure if you have any exposed metal like this that is not touching the frame. Okay, now we have to make sure we have the correct length. So this is just a tube that I notched out the end. They have a tool for this also, but I just do it this way, and that lets you know it's the correct length because it will go in the middle of your tube, so your needle stays in the middle of the tube. So once you do that, you line up your contact screw here. And then we're going to plug this in and see how it runs. This is test number 1. And we just want to see where our numbers are at. So we're at 104 cycles per second and about 59 to 60 duty, which 50 to 60 range is acceptable. I usually try to keep it around 55% duty cycle. I read somewhere Icon said that that's when your machine will be most efficient, and so I've noticed with my machines 55 is a pretty good number, so that's what I shoot for. We got to see if these springs give us the right numbers, and if not, we need to adjust. So we're doing pretty good, but we just need to make some minor adjustments. So let's see if we can speed this machine up a little bit. Another thing you want to be aware of is your stroke length. So here I've adjusted the machine again. .55 duty and 104 cycles per second, and I didn't change the springs out. I just moved this to the side and took a little bit of tension off this rear spring. But this being a liner, your typical fast liner with a short stroke, I'm going to look at this nipple here and make sure it's not traveling too far, because that will tell me the stroke length. If it's separated, it's too far. I want it to only move a little bit. So I've made some adjustments. I put a 19 gauge spring on the front to get my speed up, and I also put a lighter armature bar on. I had a 4-ounce one. This one's 3 ounces. So with that combination, my speed went from 100 to 144. So that's pretty fast, and you can see there's a dime gap here. What we do is we check our correct gaps. This is the gap I use for my liner. This is what was recommended when I was looking around, so that's about the right gap. A little less, but it's fine. We make sure that everything lines up. This lines up with my tube. So then we check our tension, which is about 400, a little less than 400. So all of that lines up and falls into place for a liner, a fast liner. What happened was I just had to make adjustments to get to the numbers I wanted. We check to make sure we have a gap in the rear, just a small gap between the armature bar and the rear coil, which we do. We are touching flat on the front core. Everything matches up. Everything is correct. If one thing is off, your machine is not tuned. It is only tuned once everything is correct and in place. So now we need to make sure that it's hitting correctly. If I can put my thumb underneath here and it can continue to hit my thumb without stopping it, we know that it can push those needles into the skin. So if it does that, then it is working correctly. With a smaller needle group, you can have a softer hit, and then you can use the same machine for a larger needle group, but you just need to turn up your voltage. So with a tattoo machine, you want to have a range where it'll still hit at low voltage, but then give you a soft hit, and then as you turn the voltage up, you can get a harder hit, which is another way to tell that it's running correctly. So this will run at 4.5 volts, but it'll run even harder if I turn it up, hitting hard at 6 volts. And so this is where we can kind of test our range here. Let's do 4.5 volts. Still hitting good at 4.5 volts, so I could say you could do small needle groups with 4.5 volts, and then if you wanted to do bigger needle groups, you could go up to 6, and even if you had to, 8 volts. So you have a range on this machine. So what I did was I put a coin on the back here, and I cut it flat so that it's even with my rear deck here. and that's got enough surface area. And what I did was I flattened the back. You got to make sure you grind down the back of the coin before you put it on here, and grind off any sharp corners it might have, and then get that on there and tighten it down really good. At this point, once everything's on and in place and running good, you want to tighten everything down really good. The screws for the coils, I put thread locker on there so that they won't move, they won't loosen up. I tightened down the post. I tightened up everything really good, because now you just want this to run for a really long time without needing to mess with it. You want to make sure none of the parts are going to move. And whenever you're transporting your equipment, you want to keep it on foam or in something where your contact screw isn't going to get hit by something and knock it out of whack. Try to, don't put these in your pocket, don't, abuse these things, don't drop them. Take nice care of your tattoo machines, and it should last you a really long time. That's what it took to get a decent liner out of this machine. And this should last you a little while. I've had this one running for several years now, but if you're not willing to do all of that, this machine is not going to run correctly for you. You can't buy these out of the box and use them. You have to work on them and adjust them and tune them correctly to get them to run correctly. If you're not willing to do everything that I've already done, I've done 2 or 3 videos on these tattoo kits, these will never work correctly for you. That's how much effort you have to put into these to get them to work. Now another thing is, I have my numbers a little high right now because there's no needle on this. So I know my numbers are a little high, just a little bit, because I know once I put the needle on here, it's going to drop my numbers down right to where they need to be. So instead of putting the needle on and testing it out, I just set everything a little bit higher, because I know from experience it's going to drop it down a little bit once I put a needle on there and start running. And then once I start tattooing with this for the first time, I'm just going to need to make a little minor adjustment here, maybe on the contact screw, to adjust it. And that should be the only adjustment I need to make.